Okay. Hey, everybody. Thanks for coming to this talk. So I'm very certain that everyone here definitely wants to provide a great user experience. That's why you're here, right? But how many people feel that visual design is part of providing that, a great user experience? Okay? All right. You good? Okay. So when I think about visual design, I think about how it has certain capabilities. It's got things that it can do to help people. So for example, how something looks is going to influence how somebody interprets what they can see. It's going to affect whether they can find what they're looking for, and it's going to affect use when it's done successfully. Also, when visual design is successful, it can help products or brands or organizations present themselves the way that they want to be perceived. So that helps with differentiation. So successful visual design can help people find what they need. It can help brands present themselves, organizations, products, and it can help differentiate. So it's got these things that it can do. It's got kind of what I think of as, powers. But it's subjective, and it's hard to talk about. So the goal for this talk is to help you realize that you already have the words that you need to have successful conversations about visual design. So we're going to talk about what those words are, or I'll talk about what those words are, and some approaches for how to use them. So I have a graphic design background. I'm classically trained in graphic design, even though I haven't done that in a long time. And I'll tell you a brief story. Early on in my career, I wonder if I move away from this, can you still hear me? Can you still hear me? Not quite as much? No? Okay. Early on in my career, I was working as a graphic designer in a traditional firm, and I was working on that project in the middle there. And the client was coming in to review the work. So I had my printouts, and I was spreading things out on the table. And he came in, and he did not love what he saw immediately. He kind of looked, and he started asking questions. And I responded in the only way that I knew how, which was I kind of internally freaked out and then started talking about graphic designers speak like white space and stuff like that because that's all I knew how to do. And I remember looking at him and seeing that whatever I was saying, it was not connecting with him. And I just remember feeling like, I don't have what I need to be successful in this situation. So much later, I was working with engineers on early dynamic applications, and I had a similar experience. I was explaining a pagination system for an application, and again, I needed to explain what I was thinking, and again, I felt like I did not have the words to bridge my understanding and the engineer's understanding. So I think, even though this was a while ago, this has kind of been a theme throughout my career, that there is a lack of shared language. We don't have a language that we share to talk about visual design. So this causes some problems, and here are a few that I've seen. So I call this one ad hoc. Sometimes the engineers are developing the application. It's got a functional user interface. And sometimes maybe there's talk of hiring a designer, but the engineer-designed application goes live. Obviously, that's more common with internal or non-consumer applications. So sometimes that's okay, but sometimes it's not. Another thing, very common, I'm sure you've all experienced it, is committees. Committees are how we need to work today. But two things that I've seen happen with talking about visual interface design in committees are everybody loves design, and they love to get together and they talk about design. But when this happens, they just come up with more and more ideas. So while they're talking to each other, they don't know how to focus and qualify what they're talking about. Other times, there's lots of talking, but there's very little agreement, and every meeting turns into a battle, a holy war. So other times, the designer either puts themselves or is put in this role of what I call psychic shorter to cook. And it's like, oh, this stakeholder likes a little bit of this, and this stakeholder likes a little bit of this, and I'll just, put it all in a bowl and whip it up, and then we'll have an interface. But then the results are random, and they lack a rationale. And other times, I'm sure everybody's familiar with this. Who's familiar with like the Rockstar Designer wanted, right? It's like it's everywhere. It makes me crazy anyway. Sometimes the designers are considered to be, whether it's one person or its team, they're considered special, like they've got magical powers. And the design is done in isolation from the rest of the team. And that never really has good or long-term, at least long-term results. There's no buy-in. So obviously, I'm here and doing this talk because I think better communication can help. So has anybody seen this book, Crucial Conversations? It's been around for a while. It's pretty common, and it focuses on how to help business teams have successful conversations in kind of high-stakes situations. So just to take a few tips from that. The authors talk about how dialogue is the essential ingredient, that you have to have dialogue in order to have a successful conversation. And that in order to have dialogue, you have to kind of shift from all these individual interpretations of meaning, and you have to have what they call a shared pool of meaning. So in order to have a shared pool of meaning, you have to be able to share your ideas. But I don't know about you guys, but in my experience, that's kind of where the trouble starts, is, how do you share your ideas and opinions? Because, if you don't do it successfully, you get a lot of arguing and debating, which is not having a good time in the pool. Okay, so if we think about these situations earlier, and we think about this idea of a shared pool of meaning and dialogue, we think about this rockstar design, there's really no dialogue happening. What I call holy war design, where the teams are talking but they don't agree, they're not sharing meaning. There's no shared pool. They never get to that shared understanding. When you've got the team and they're all unfocused and they love design and they love being creative and everybody's a designer, they may be talking a lot and they may even be sharing meaning, but they're certainly not focused, and it doesn't help things move forward. And in this situation, there's not dialogue and there's not focus. So what can we do to help focus? Anybody familiar with this book? It's a good one. If you have kids, I highly recommend it. So the authors of this book, How to Talk So Your Kids Will Listen and Listen So Your Kids Will Talk, their approach is kind of, you kind of stay impassionate, and you start out by, you kind of state what you see. No blame. This is kind of like, here's what I see. You use few straightforward words, and of course, you listen without judgment. So these are good tips for starting out, to start to get to that shared understanding. So even though we're talking about design, sometimes people think that that's a reason to kind of get really, really critical, and, my opinion is super important. And this was supposed to be funny, but nobody's laughing. It's okay, it's supposed to be funny. So we don't want Joan Rivers, we don't want to get critical and crazy. We want to kind of be calm and stating what we see. So if we go back to this ad hoc design situation when the engineers the engineering design application goes live, this issue isn't really about whether or not there's dialogue or whether or not there's focus. It's more that this isn't really a successful long-term strategy. It's a temporary situation. Okay, so we know that we want to have a dialogue and we know that we need focus. So what can we do? Well, if we think about interface design, or when I think about interface design, and I think about what are we really talking about, I think about how can we get specific about what we're talking about so that we can be clear that everybody is understanding that we're talking about the same thing. And even though interface design seems kind of squishy and subjective, when I think about it, it really comes down to you're talking about the visual characteristics of content. And for me, they really fall into one of 5 categories. So if we can identify clearly what we're talking about and we're stating what we see, then that starts to get our meanings into the pool in kind of a safe way. So as I said, these are characteristics of content, and they are what affects interpretation. So if people are familiar with Scott McCloud, he's got this blew my mind the first time I saw this. He talks about art, and he kind of divides it into 2 categories. And he talks about it in one category, it's kind of artists as exploring the medium that they work in. So it's very, there's not a message. It's more, what can I do with this medium, maybe that's new or different or hasn't been done before or reflects my personal feelings. The other way he talks about art is he talks about it as a tool. And he talks about it as a tool for telling the story, that as communicators, when we're thinking about designing a visual language, layout, position, typography, color, imagery, and we're talking about interfaces, these are really the tools that we have to communicate our message. So really briefly, these are obvious, so I'm just going to go through these quickly. Layout and position, the placement of elements in relation to one another. Sounds really obvious, but it can affect how people interpret what they see. Does it feel comfortable? Does it feel crowded? Are these things that are kind of clustered together, are they similar, and does that cluster make sense or not? Typography, obviously, the selection of typeface and fonts, selection and use is going to affect interpretation. Color, same thing. Choice of color and use is going to affect how users interpret. Imagery, same thing. Is it a pattern? Is it an icon? Is it a symbol? Do you use a photo? Do you use a video? These seem like really detail-oriented choices in deciding what you use, but those decisions are going to affect interpretation. Lastly, yesterday, before Don Norman spoke, this said controls affordances and movement. So I had to change that quickly. Signifiers, so I know I said you guys, everybody knows these words, but I think we're all going to have to get used to signifiers, which, okay. But what we're talking about here is that there's a choice in what controls you use to present to somebody, and then there's a choice in how they're actually styled. So, visual design here is the tool that we have for making the controls understandable and for helping people know how to use them. So even just in the consideration of a single control, the layout, the imagery, and I call gradation, I'll put that in kind of the imagery category, type, those all come into play in helping people interpret controls. Okay, so we've identified, what we're talking about, so we can be clear. But now, let's move on to the next kind of thing that we need to do, is we need to know how to characterize those things. So of the elements that we just talked about, for example, typography or color, they all have their own individual languages. And I think that that's one reason why people feel maybe intimidated. They feel like they don't know the right word to use. Do they use hue or do they use color? And when is it a serif and when it's not? But really, that's not so important for what we're talking about. Because to get to a shared pool of meaning, we need to characterize at a high level. We need to use common terms that everybody can understand without getting hung up. Okay, so here's a little shot of very simple mobile weather app called Solar. Has anybody seen this before? Everybody seen it? Yeah. Okay, so if you had one word to characterize it, what would you say? Anybody? You can. Elegant. Okay. Anybody else? Minimalist. Okay. What did somebody else say? I heard something else. Ambient. Okay. Okay. All right. So let's look at another one. Actually, this looks really blown out, but I think everybody's familiar with it. How would you characterize this one in one word? Sorry? Informative, okay. Detailed? Sorry? Busy, okay. Okay. So when I was working on research for the book that I wrote a year ago, I came across this study by these two Israeli researchers, Talia Levy and Noam Chetinsky. It was published in 2003. So this is, you can read, Assessing the Dimensions of Perceived Visual Aesthetics of Websites. So what was going on with this is these researchers already knew and were already familiar with the studies that say, people think that attractive websites work better. Okay, so they took that as, yes, we know that. And they sought to understand, okay, but how do people perceive the aesthetic qualities? So what they found is that user perception fell into really two main, what they call dimensions. Okay, so two main dimensions. And those dimensions are two words that they have for them. They have classical, and these are their words, well-organized, clear, clean, symmetrical. So lots of times, the most common word I hear when I'm talking to a client about what they want their interface to look like, the number one word is clean. Okay? What does clean mean? You know what I mean? It can mean different things to different people. But when you start to think about classical and you think about organized, symmetrical, we start to get a little bit more clarity around what that might mean in terms of aesthetic characteristics. So the second term is expressive. So expressive is obviously, it's more about the designer expressing themselves. And in their words, they say, it may involve using special effects. There's an aspect of originality. So since I found out about these two terms, I've been using them. I've been using them with my students, and I've been using them with clients. And I have to say, it's gone really well. And once, if I start saying a word like, if we're talking about, if they're saying, I want a really clean interface, then we can kind of look at an example and we can talk about, I'll say, this is expressive or this is classical, and we can start to kind of get into that shared pool. All right, so let's look at some more specifics. Okay, so we're back to weather applications, weather apps, and there's so many weather apps. Why are there so many weather apps? That's a whole other talk. But let's use those terms, expressive and classical, to kind of drill into what's going on here. So I guess that's on your left. There's the two Apple default weather apps, the older one and the newer one. So if we think about expressive versus classical, we think about, the layout is pretty symmetrical, okay? And we can say that the typography is certainly not expressive, okay? So we've got pretty classical typography. And then if we look at that kind of the sun image over there, you know, it's got some dimensionality, it's kind of special effects, so it's a little more expressive. And in terms of a very classical interface, that sun is a little bit, you know, that's the expressive element. Those little images are the expressive elements. Very similar with the newer one, although it's even kind of more symmetrical and you know, even less expressive, even though it's got this large photo in the background. So then if we go over to the other two, again, we've got solar, and this is dark sky. You know, solar's got this very symmetrical layout. Again, I would say, you know, so it's classical layout, classical type, you know, but then it's got these background images. Okay, so what are those? Are those expressive or are those classical? What do you guys think? Good. We can get in that pool. We can talk about it. Well, I mean, ultimately, I mean, they are both, you know. So it's very expressive in that it's using color to communicate how a temperature feels, all right? But in terms of, you know, how it's being presented in a very classical way. And then we've got dark sky over here. And again, I mean, it's got these stripes in the background. I don't know if you can see them. The controls have a lot of shading. You know, the typography is kind of big and shadowed. So this is a little bit more expressive. So what does this mean, you know, when we're designing applications? The characteristics that we select need to be chosen based on, you know, what the goals are that we're trying to achieve with the application and who is going to be using it, right? So in the case of Apple, you know, that's a default application. It's going to be used by a very wide audience. Okay, what would happen if it was super expressive? I mean, this is one case where they kind of, you know, the more expressive something is, you know, the more likely it's going to sort of alienate people because it's more about the designer's expression. So a default weather app needs to be pretty classical. Okay, but then that leaves an opportunity. It leaves an opportunity for solar and dark sky to do something different. And why do they do something different? I mean, has anybody here downloaded a weather app and you use it regularly that's not your weather app? And why did you do it?
Because it was super simple. It was just a real pleasure to use. He's just a two-cluttered, wants to know what the weather was doing now rather than what it's doing whenever.
Okay, so you wanted even more simple. You wanted even more, did you want even more elegant?
Not necessarily elegant, but just
even more simple.
more simple.
Okay. So there's an opportunity here, and there's an opportunity. Oh, that's really simple. What was that? Okay, haze, okay. All right, so if you want super simple, there's haze. The alternatives can be an opportunity for a personal expression. You know, a weather app, something you look at all the time. You know, if there's a whole bunch of them, you can kind of select the one that speaks to you. So if we think about solar, you know, it's a little more emotional, but it's still very refined. Some people may find it beautiful, some people may not, but that's okay because it's a choice whether you download it or not. With dark sky, they are appealing. They've got more information, and they're appealing to a little bit more of a weather geek, but they still want it to look very clean. So they've got a new version out, and that one goes even more towards providing information, but kind of for the weather geek, but it doesn't look like, you know, radar. You know, it's highly stylized. It's, you know, it's got this refined aesthetic. So now that we've talked a little bit about characterizing, how do we determine what's good? Okay, so, you know, what's the criteria to assess a visual interface? You know, Nielsen Norman Group, and I don't mean to just pick on them, but if we look at all their reports, they have nearly 2,400 guidelines for visual interfaces. That's just one organization. Okay, there's so many, it's impossible for us to all keep up on them. And there's so many that anybody on the team can find a guideline or a recommendation to justify whatever personal subjective opinion that they have. And then we're right back in holy war land. So in my experience, successful user interfaces, and when there's a problem in a visual user interface, it really pretty much comes down to one of three categories. And these are so fundamental, these categories, to how people understand and interpret user interfaces. I call them the meta principles. So, for example, old one, everybody's familiar with. That's part of our goal here. This is something you're all familiar with. There's consistency, or there's inconsistency. When things appear or they don't appear the way that people expect. There's similarities and differences. Well, there's similarities, when somebody's going from one screen to another screen to another screen. So there's similarities and differences within applications. And then there's similarities and differences between applications. So the similarities lead to expectations. A really stupid, obvious example is the search box. We all expect it to be a certain place on a website. We expect that. When there's differences, it leads to questions. It may slow people down. It's kind of Steve Krug, don't make us think. Similarities aren't always good, though, and then that goes back to expression and differentiation. And difference isn't always bad, but that's another topic. So hierarchy and no hierarchy. Again, I'm sure everybody in this room is familiar with this concept. In the Google screen on the left, we can tell what looks important. We've got the red button that draws the eye. We've got the column in the middle that's wider than the other two, but there's still attention being drawn. So there's kind of there's visual characteristics that are suggesting, how our eye moves around the page. That's kind of supporting flow in this case. When compared to the Salesforce dashboard, there's no hierarchy at all. And, the gradation really draws my eye, but it's applied randomly. How do we know where to look? How do we know what's important? I can't figure it out. I don't know if you guys can. Lastly is personality. So personality is what people interpret based on how things appear. And the thing to remember about personality is that even when no conscious decisions are made about how characteristics appear in a visual interface, people still interpret them. You cannot keep people from interpreting what they see. It happens automatically. So even a lack of intentional decisions leads to people kind of thinking. It leads to an interpretation of personality. But ideally, personality tells the story that the organization, wants to tell, and differentiates it in a way that sets it apart and helps people, either feel some affinity towards it or not. It helps people feel like, oh, this is the application for me. I can look at this interface if I'm browsing in the App Store, and I can say, okay, I can tell this is what it looks like, what I can do here. I get a sense for how it might feel to use this. So, is this for me? It helps answer, what is this? Who is it for? Is it for me? What might interacting with it be like? So here we have two different screens with shopping lists. Obviously, it's Epicurious on the left. The one on the right is Grocery Gadget. So if we think about what's going on here, we think about, Epicurious. If somebody said, oh, yeah, I want a red image in the background of every single screen, that sounds like a really bad idea. Red is visually very strong, and then you get a photo, what's going on there? But it's being done very successfully. It's just in the background. You can't really see it because it's kind of blown out. They've got red buttons, okay? So it's serving as a background. And then it's got this expressive background, this expressive color, with this classical type and classical layout on top of it. Pretty straightforward, yet using some visual characteristics to differentiate, give it some personality. So grocery gadget, you know, it's generic, okay? It could be, we can't tell what it's for. However, you know, it's got some fairly expressive elements. You know, if you look at all these gradations, the interface is kind of taking over what we see here. But in terms of, you know, creating affinity and trying to feel like, oh, this is the app for me, you know, that these are not going to appeal to the same person. Okay, so how do we pull all this together? You know, the elements and their characteristics are how consistency, hierarchy, and personality get conveyed. So I've got target here because those are kind of the principles that we're shooting for. That doesn't mean to say that we always want to be consistent, but we always want to be consistent within the goals that we're trying to achieve. So we want to use clear communication. When we use clear communication in our teams, we can start to get to that shared pool. And when we can talk about things in a clear way, it'll help us be clearer in the decisions that we make in our interface designs. So if we think about going back to what we looked at, we think about identify and say what you see. So, you know, for example, this orange button is different from the others. Okay, just stating what we see. And we're saying what we're talking about specifically. I mean, we could say control, you know, but that would be a little silly. We're going to characterize with clear terms. You know, well, this button is more expressive because it's more important. So we're thinking about, you know, hierarchy and the visual characteristics. You know, but it looks more important than the buy now button. So we're starting to assess. So here, you know, it's a question of, okay, there's visual hierarchy. This thing looks really important, but, you know, is that appropriate for what we're trying to do? And then you can say, well, maybe it is too expressive. You know, maybe it went too far. So I hope this is helpful. I hope this gives you some framework for going out and talking with your teams and making more intentional decisions about visual design characteristics in the user interfaces that you work on. And I'd love to hear how it goes. So thank you.